It's Coleggio. Today I wanted to talk about Trump and a third term for the presidency. His allies are talking about it. What the hell is going on? So I'm going to give an ultra-realist take on the background, the history, and how we got here. And then maybe most importantly, why are we even talking about this? Okay, so the background is that in early April, the Trump organization started selling Trump 2028 hats. Then people were asking Trump in the Oval Office, reporters saying, well, are you going to run for a third term? They can't really do that, can you? And he was non-committal. He didn't really answer the question. People were posing, well, if he ran for a third term, maybe Obama could run for a third term, and that would be like the epic clash of titans. But what really kind of drove this more recently is Trump's first campaign manager, Steve Bannon, was on the Bill Maher show last weekend. And he was talking about how Trump was not only going to run for president in 2028, but that he was going to be president in 2029 for another 4 years at least. All right, so how did we get here? Is this crazy talk? Is this even possible? And then again, like why are we talking about this? Why now? Okay, so the background in the United States is that we've always had two terms for president, both in tradition and then also in law, but with one exception. One of the great moments in American democracy was in 1796, when President George Washington, fresh after beating the British, serving his citizens for two terms as president of the United States, voluntarily stepped down. It's one of the great moments in world democracy. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever decided to not cling to power for their own benefit, but rather he stepped down to have a new election for a new president by his fellow citizens. It's great. If you ever seen the musical Hamilton, it talks about this beautifully. So even in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, this was novel. Not most of the delegates, but many of the delegates were talking about having a president for life or having a president with a 7-year term or a longer term than that. But we settled on 4 years, but there was no strict rule against running for more terms. It was a hard tradition set by Washington. President Thomas Jefferson praised this several years later when he was president. He said, if you didn't have, this kind of unwritten rule of stepping down, you'd have an inheritance. You'd devolve into families controlling the presidential throne, if you will, of America. So that tradition held all the way for about 140 years until President Roosevelt. In 1940, he's served for 8 years. He's being very coy about whether or not he's going to run for a third term. And then the delegates in the convention, the Democratic Convention, nominate him. He takes the nomination. He serves another 4 years. Again, he serves another 4 years in 1944. The Republican Thomas Dewey made this a campaign issue. He said that this was authoritarian to have a president running this many times. I think that that argument was strong, but because we were still at the end of World War II, we had troops on the ground in Europe. I think that it was a little bit too much to pluck Roosevelt out. And of course, Roosevelt won the fourth term, but then died very shortly into his fourth term, and Harry Truman became office. Now, in response to this thing, the president being elected for 4 terms, Congress moved very quickly to pass an amendment to the Constitution that would prevent presidents from serving more than 2 terms. So they passed this in the House and the Senate in 1947, and then it took another 3 years and 343 days, almost 4 years, for the state legislatures to ratify this as an amendment to the Constitution. It's very difficult to change the Constitution of the United States. You need supermajorities in the House and the Senate, and then you need 2/3 of the state legislatures, and it takes a long time for this to come to a conclusion. And it finally did in 1951. Now, I want to read what the 22nd Amendment said because I had to refresh myself on it. Here's what it says. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. Okay, so the first part is very clear. No one shall be elected more than twice. That sets the term limits. Now, some people were saying, well, what about those other 2 years? Could the president run for another 2 years? The answer is no. It's very clear. What they're going after here is the idea that if you were a vice president who became a president, if you served less than half of that president's term when you took office, you should be able to run for another 2 terms. But a president should never serve for more than 10 years. So what this could have done is, in 1963, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy gets shot in November of 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson takes office, and then he serves for the last year of Kennedy's term, gets elected to a full term in 1964, and he would have been able to run for another full term in 1968. had the war not been going so terribly and had he not just had such a disaster of a presidency. So that's what it was allowing. It was not allowing somebody to run for another, 2 years of the presidency. That is clearly not allowed. Okay, so if you're taking a strict view of the Constitution, this is off limits. You can't, President Trump cannot run for a third term. So is it even possible? Well, it is possible because one of the things we don't like to think about is that institutions often bend rules, especially when rules are difficult to change. Okay, this happens all the time in corporations, it'll happen in churches, it'll happen in small governments, and even big governments. One example of the Constitution changing, not in word, but in deed, was in the 1930s under Roosevelt. Now, up until that point, the federalism dictated that the federal government had a lot of power, had certain powers, and state governments had certain powers. And anything that wasn't specifically, any power that wasn't specifically delegated to the federal government was a state issue. So it's the Great Depression. President Roosevelt comes in, he's passing all these new laws, nationalizing the economy, workers and unions and healthcare and Social Security. And the Supreme Court is looking at this and they're saying, actually, President Roosevelt, you don't have the power to do this. And they started striking down his initiatives on the constitutional basis that the federal government didn't have power to do what he was doing. Roosevelt struck back. He started talking about packing the court with more justices, his own justices. And finally, the Supreme Court relented and allowed Roosevelt to do all these things, even though technically it wasn't really allowed within the Constitution. And then a new norm was set that the government can do all these things. And before you knew it, you had all kinds of federal government dramatically expanded in its role from the 1930s through the 1970s because a new norm was set. And even though today it says that the federal government doesn't have these powers, we've kind of accepted that they do. So people can bend or ignore rules in the Constitution and set new norms. Could that happen here? I don't think so. I mean, the 1930s, and we were dealing with the Great Depression. There was kind of a bipartisan consensus that something needed to be done, and the Supreme Court was kind of pushing back. Also, federalism is a little bit of an esoteric concept. I don't think anyone really fully thought through that. If we can't have federal unemployment insurance, then we have to make sure that all the states do it. So it was a little bit less clear. I think it was clear, but it was a little bit easier to ignore. Here we have a rule that says no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. All right, and Republicans are usually the kind of the defenders of the Constitution, people who are conservative. They believe in the Constitution. It's really, really difficult to get around what the wording says there. Can he change the Constitution? Highly unlikely, right? You'd have to pass a constitutional amendment, both houses. You'd have to ratify it in the state legislatures. It would take 4 years. They're not going to do that before 2028. So they're not going to bend the rules. They're not going to change the rules. The only real way for the president to serve a third term would be for him to do it basically by seizing the office. And that quickly devolves into a very deep and dark place. You can start foreseeing Democratic state legislatures refusing to put him on the ballot. You can visualize people taking up arms. This goes to a very, very dark place very quickly. All right. So the president cannot serve 2 terms in the written way. They're not going to change the rules. They're not really going to bend the rules. The only way that he can do it is through power and force. And that gets very, very ugly very, very quickly. So then the question is, why the hell are we talking about this? Like, what is it that's going on that suddenly we're having conversations about Trump having a third term? And I think that there are 2 explanations for this. First is that Trump, again, I mention all the time, he's a monopoly player, he's a master poker player, all he cares about is negotiation. I think that Trump likes the idea of people thinking that he's a little bit crazy, that he's a little bit unhinged. Because if you are negotiating with somebody who's a little bit nuts, you have less of an idea, and you have less of an idea what they're actually thinking in their heads. It makes it very difficult for you to start a kind of initial point of negotiation. All right. So, one of the things, an example of people are going through these tariffs, and the president's Treasury Secretary is saying one thing, and his Commerce Secretary is saying another thing, and the president's saying another thing. And no one really knows why Trump is pushing the tariffs. Now, if you're China and you knew for certain what Trump wanted, you could negotiate back from that point. But if you don't know what he wants, it makes the negotiation a lot more difficult. So I think that part of this is that Trump likes the idea that people think that he's a little bit unhinged. Okay, that's part of it. The second part of it is that there's this whole question of being the center of attention and being trolling his opponents. All right. We know that Trump loves to step into the spotlight wherever the spotlight exists. This started, and it was so unusual in the 2016 campaign. He would just insert himself into the narrative on a daily basis. No one had ever done that before. I think no one had ever had the power to do that before. But Trump was so good at using the news media to his advantage. He didn't even spend money on television ads. He just was basically constantly able to insert himself into whatever narrative was going on in the country on that day. All right. So that's part of it. And then this whole idea that he can say something crazy, even though here he didn't say anything. He's been mum on it. It's been his advisors that have been saying it. But he'll say something will get suggested, and it drives people absolutely apoplectically crazy. And I don't know what the psychology is there or why it's so enjoyable. You might remember back in the debate between him and Kamala Harris back in September, we had that whole thing with the people eating the dogs, eating the cats, and suddenly the whole country was talking about whether or not there are people eating dogs and cats. Now, I don't know if it was a distraction. I don't know if he just did it because he thought it was funny. But the fact was that he got people in the country and the world talking about this question of whether people or not were, eating their pets. And that could be a distraction from things that he doesn't want people to talk about. It could just be a way of staying front and center in the attention. It could be a way of helping, the narrative that maybe he's a little bit unhinged. You don't really know what he's going to want to do. And I think that there's a value in that for him, that he wants people to not know what he's up to. And of course, here we are today. It's May of 2025, and I'm doing a video on Trump running for a third term. All right. So I've fallen for the bait. We've all fallen for it. If you're watching this video, you've fallen for the bait, and we're talking about Trump and a third term. So let me know what you think. Drop a comment. Give me a follow. Love to talk to you. Thanks.